Mellody, Enrique, we are just thrilled to have you here today as part of the Innovating Equity Summit at Silicon Valley Leadership Group. We could not have a better set of leaders to talk about DEI and the issues facing corporate America and Silicon Valley. So right off the bat, I want to say a huge thank you and welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you.
Well, Mellody, I'll start with you. Our last conversation, you were pretty open and direct about Silicon Valley, about DEI across our companies, and where there was room for improvement and work to be done. Now, I don't want a report card per se, unless you want to go in that direction, but just to level set, where in your view do we stand around DEI here in Silicon Valley today?
I think there's a long way to go. I sit in San Francisco right now in the Ariel San Francisco office, so I'm not speaking as an outsider. I'm speaking as someone who is close by in proximity. And my assessment from both being in the Valley and also around the Valley is that there is a lot of talk, there's a lot of activity. The action and the actual results are still wanting. We have a very long way to go, particularly in the tech sector, to line up the outcomes with the desires. And the reason that I push so hard on this issue is because I think of all the sectors out there that have innovated and have forced meaningful change, that have disrupted in ways that none of us thought was imaginable. It's been Silicon Valley and the technology space. And yet, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think that the industry is lagging woefully. And one good example, Enrique is here, who's a phenomenal leader and a great example of diversity, equity, and inclusion at work in terms of true success for someone who has earned it. But you can't point to a lot of senior leaders in Silicon Valley who are diverse.
That's a fact. And Mellody, I think that's a good segue for Enrique. And Enrique, as you know, I do not believe in corporate America, at least, there is a better speaker around diversity and the issues we are confronting than Mellody. Mellody, the way you speak truth to power, how compelling you are. I think that this dialogue could not be more important than it is today. And so, Enrique, I wouldn't ask you in any way to maybe critique what Mellody has said. I'd be curious about your experience, your lived experience around the Valley, working your way up from an intern. Where do you see DEI around our companies in Silicon Valley currently?
So first of all, thank you for having me here. And it's a big honor to be in the same panel than Mellody. And I actually cannot critique what she said, because I agree very strongly that if this was a pass-fail system, the Valley would be failing today in diversity and inclusion. And I think many of the conversations that we are having now, or that we have been having in the last year and a half, are conversations that should have happened 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And the actions that we are starting to take now are actions that should have been taken many, many months or years before. So I think we have failed. On the positive side, though, I think more and more people and more leaders are aware that this is an area where we need to drive change, where we need to set aggressive objectives and align our companies to drive this change. This is what we are doing in HP, and this is what is being done in many other companies. But despite the progress that has happened recently, we have a long way to go to where we think any company in the technology space or not in the technology space should be in terms of diversity and inclusion.
Well, Enrique, so the assessment is clear. We've got a long way to go. I think we're all on the same page there. When we pivot and look at the accelerants to change, right? And obviously, Enrique, you're making big strides at HP. But Mellody, I think of ESG and ESG investments where we've seen, it's a multi-trillion-dollar global market around environment and sustainability. In no way am I equating the two. I don't know if perhaps for executives and investors, environment is easier to jump into than DEI. But if you look at a successful movement, Mellody, like ESG, following that capital, what can we learn from that around DEI? And from your seat, obviously your investment and institutional investment experience, where are some of those key learning points for DEI movement and momentum?
That is a great question because I've thought about this a lot. When you talk about ESG, environmental, social governance, the DEI conversation falls within the social, and I would suggest the governance verticals of ESG. But interestingly, when you rank order these things, there's no question that ESG has a bias towards the E. I often think of the E as being in a capital letter and the S and G become successively smaller in emphasis. And I think part of the reason for that is because of the external demands around the issue of climate. They make a lot of sense. The customers, the regulators, the community is demanding action in this area. That has put a tremendous amount of pressure on corporate America as well as corporations globally. And at the end of the day, they have to respond to that pressure. Proxy vote resolutions, all sorts of things have happened in that regard. And suddenly that conversation has really taken off. I think that we are waiting for that to happen in the conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have not seen that same pressure. We've not seen that same internal pressure from people or external pressure, but I think it's coming because of the virtual nature of the society that we have today. You have nowhere to hide. If you say it and you don't mean it or deliver, people will come for you. That is the society we live in now. Our employees will walk out. We've seen that happen in Silicon Valley. So a result of that, I think the day of reckoning is coming. And to the extent that corporations do not take this issue seriously with actions as well as opposed to just talk, I think that they are looking at some harder days ahead. I've said this many times, and I really do believe it, to the extent that you want to be a world-class 21st century company and you do not truly have a diverse workforce, do not truly have diverse leadership or diverse board, you're committing corporate suicide. And it's not a question of if you will die, it's a question of when. And yes, it can take a very long time, but it doesn't end well.
Well, Mellody, to double click on your point about actions and acting now, do you believe Silicon Valley in particular versus, New York, the financial sector, many of the other leading industries and regions, do you believe that we have been behind, or is the comment more generally that across corporate sectors, we have to make this progress now? Do we have a starting point that is behind some of the other industries and sectors?
I do think so. Now, I think one good move and one good outcome is that the reporting is now happening in a widespread way. Again, that's been demanded. Corporations have had to respond to pressures on reporting on these issues. And so now at least we have some transparency around the numbers, but that is not enough. Awareness is not enough. And now to go from that, to develop concrete policies that get at scale. The one thing that is amazing about the tech sector and Silicon Valley in general is that you solve really hard problems. I mean, hard. We have tourists going to space right now. These are hard things. And when you think about applying that same sort of ingenuity to break through ideas in diversity and equity and inclusion, this is where I would expect it to come from. And yet we've seen more of the same, policies and practices that will lead to incremental, not the scale change that the Valley is famous for.
Well, Enrique, your position is unique. HP has one of the most diverse board of directors around, and you've made several big announcements, doubling your Black executive population by 2025. So as Mellody says, math has no opinion. Clearly you've got those metrics in place. What is working? What's not? What are your takeaways so far as you set, to Mellody's point, some goals that are a little more ambitious than your peers?
Well, certainly having a diverse executive team and a diverse board help, because it's very visible to us the value that we can get by really building a more diverse company. But probably the number one lesson beyond that is that there is strong demand for this. More and more, our investors are asking for this. Our customers are asking for a more diverse company, a company that represents our consumers. And our employees are demanding that as well. So there is a clear need from all our stakeholders to move in this direction. And we need to take advantage of that and drive action, as Mellody was saying. I think when we look at why more progress have not happened in the last years, there are some reasons that I think we all need to listen to, but at the same time reject. We many times hear that there are not enough candidates to create a more diverse workforce. Well, there are not enough candidates because we don't look for them in the right places, or we don't put enough energy looking for them. And this is clearly something that we have changed. We, for example, are working with HBCUs to every time more and more to create a diverse pool of candidates that we can attract to the company. I think also we need to make sure that the leaders of the companies are accountable for driving this change and for these goals. We need to make sure that in the same way executives have a goal for revenue, profit, or growth in certain segments, right, we need to measure and define goals in terms of diversity and how are they improving the diversity of the goals. And this is something we have done, and this is something we pay executives based on. And finally, as Mellody was saying, we need to increase transparency, because one of the things that is more difficult to do today is to compare companies that are making progress with companies that are not making progress. And I think defining the right metrics that all of us will have to report, I think is going to help to increase the mobilization and to increase more companies, to drive more companies to drive change.
If I could just follow up on that, I can't.
Please, Mellody, yeah.
There are just so many things buried in that answer that are so important and just worth at least taking a moment to even take a bit further. So this idea that we read annual reports for a living at Ariel, the number of annual reports that say diversity is, quote, a strategic imperative. That is literally the line that you read over and over again. Every other strategic imperative inside of a corporation is directly tied to incentives. If EPS, profitability, product launch dates, I can go on and on. You get what you incent in corporate America. So I always say to people, if diversity is a strategic imperative, can you have a superstar in your company, like truly a superstar, get their full bonus and not have a diverse team? If the answer is yes, it's not a strategic imperative. And you're misleading the reader in that regard. So that's one piece of it. That incentive piece is so important. The other idea is this pipeline discussion. I think there is so much over-rotation to the pipeline. We're constantly talking about the pipeline. And I remember one white executive said to me, which I thought was brilliant. He's like, you know what's great about the pipeline? No competition when you're senior. And I was like, that's right. He's like, we'd like to talk about the pipeline all day long. Pipeline is great, but if no one, those young Black and brown people that you're recruiting from those HBCUs or wherever they may come from, if they don't see anyone at the top, they're not staying. They want to know that they can be successful, that they can get to the highest level of organizations. So then there becomes a conversation about there are not enough engineers graduating. And I say, one thing we do, we go to law school. Black and Latinx, Hispanics, we've been lawyers for 40 years. You know, we can be general counsels. We can be heads of marketing. There are a whole host of areas where you can show senior leadership in that senior suite that will inspire those young people who come into the organization. And I would say Enrique's numbers are probably moving because he's there. He's him, and it becomes a beacon for those young people who say, wow, one day I could run the company, just like I think happens at Ariel.
Well, I'm very curious on that last point, and maybe it gets a little more personal. For me, I'm new as a CEO only a year, but I don't see people who look like me on calls, and I'm fortunate to talk to a lot of CEOs in this role. And we have the top Black corporate voice, top brown, Hispanic corporate voice in America on this call today. And unfortunately, it's a pretty small pool to pick from. Enrique, do you think maybe 30 plus years at HP, internal all the way up, you got 50,000 plus employees. Is there a different standard for you? Do you feel that you've got a responsibility that might be different from your predecessors, given your Hispanic heritage?
Well, I'm not sure if it is different, but I clearly feel the responsibility. I think that many times I tell my story that I started in the company as an intern, and I was able and lucky enough to grow through it. And I share it because I know it's motivating for new people that is joining the company, diverse people that think, oh, this will never happen. And I tell you, if someone with my accent can be the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Everybody can do it. And I think it's important for me, for Mellody, to share our stories, because there is nothing more motivational than that for young employees. And this is also one way to attract talent to the company, because they see what is possible. And if they are motivated for having a strong career, this clearly will help us also to join the company. So I feel the responsibility, and I use my story as much as I can, because I think it can make a difference.
Well, it's an incredible story. And this kind of needles at me a little bit. And Mellody, I'd be very curious about your perspective. I sometimes feel, if we look at our Black community, if we look at our Latinx brothers and sisters, that sometimes there's almost competition. That might be too strong a word. But sometimes we're not fully aligned at trying to bring each of us up at the same time. Now, there's a very different set of systemic issues that different groups in this country have faced that you both know well. And Mellody, I'd be curious about your perspective around how minority groups can work together to try and drive change, because it can't be all Black women, it can't be all Hispanic males. We have to find a way for Black and brown communities to drive this change, particularly because we have so few of you all out there.
I couldn't agree with you more. And the only way that is going to work is for us to work together, for us to understand this is not a zero-sum game for anyone. It's not a zero-sum game for a white man who may be threatened by this diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation, or for minority groups who are in such small numbers in these organizations, also trying to expand their presence and reputation inside of companies. What I find so interesting is oftentimes when companies, particularly in the Valley, report their diversity numbers, it's a multicultural umbrella. They put every ethnicity together, and then they report this number that I'm like, And even oftentimes they throw gender in there too, because the women are underrepresented in the technology space. So they put this multicultural umbrella out there, and I'm like, no, that's not allowed. You need to cut the data by ethnicity. And in so doing, you see the underrepresentation. You see where the numbers really are, and that has happened more and more. Once you do that, we need to be aligned and understand that working together is how we move forward, not being pitted against each other or thinking there's only room for one of us. I think that's been the problem. You see that on boards. You see that also they want a Black director. They want a Latinx director. And it's so interesting to me because I've given this thought experiment many times. If I showed you the board of a huge company, let's just say it's ExxonMobil, and every single board member was Black, you would say, what is up with that? You would have this visceral reaction, right? But we don't have that reaction to all white male boards, or especially in some of the private companies that haven't even gone public yet. And then we have this idea that one becomes sufficient, as opposed to thinking through that more can be better, so that we don't end up thinking, well, I need to get the one seat or the one opportunity that's going to be given. Our numbers don't even reflect that. I want the diversity statistics to track the demographics of our society. If it did, we wouldn't be doing this, picking and choosing around one minority group.
Well, that's very well said, Mellody. And Enrique, I would love to hear your perspective, and maybe in particular around your approach to HP. Mellody has talked about the data, how important that is. Obviously, the quantitative analytical piece is very important to you as well.
Yeah, so let me start from that, and then I will share my view. I think HP is a company of engineers. And what this means is that when we have a problem, we define a numeric goal, and then we have the path to address that problem. What are the actions that we need to take next month, and what improvements do we expect to see in a month, in 3 months, in a year? And we are applying to diversity our engineering methodology. So we have defined long-term goals, and then from these long-term goals, we are reviewing the plans and the progress every quarter and every year. We are basically managing it as we manage any other goal, any other business goal that we have in the company. And we have defined, as you were saying, fairly aggressive goals. We have committed to double the number of Black and African American executives within the next 3 years now. We have also defined that by 2030, we want 50-50 gender parity in executive levels, which is a fairly difficult goal to achieve given the starting point that we have today. But our methodology is clear. Long-term goal divided by specific goals over time and measuring progress and making everybody accountable for that is a metric that every leader in the company has in his or her scorecard and that we track regularly. And then in terms of whether we see differences or conflicts between the different diverse groups, I think we need to have a common goal. I agree with Mellody. It is not a zero-sum game. By having a more diverse company, a more diverse executive team, a more diverse engineering team, our company will perform better. We will understand better our customers. And this is really an incentive that we need to drive in everything we do. And at the same time, we know that this is going to be helping us from a business perspective because our customers more and more value the fact that we represent the right values in the society, that we have a goal of having a positive impact. And over time, this also translates into a positive, a big
Right.
business differentiator.
If I could just add on to that, which is,
yes, please.
I'm listening to you, Enrique. I just agree with you so much. One of my favorite lines is from McKinsey. They have a line that says, observe your obligation to dissent. And when I think about Silicon Valley, I think about businesses that were built on dissension and disruption, saying this is, some people ask why, some people ask why not. This is the why not group, right? And so they're always looking at things slightly differently and going up against whatever the norm is that exists at that time. What I find so interesting, that is the actual genius of diversity, that you're bringing together these dissenting voices, you're bringing together these different points of view. So it's ironic that in an industry or in an area that is created vast fortunes and created the biggest businesses in the world, by going up against a conventional view and being willing to argue a point, that the voices inside start to become more homogeneous by virtue of the backgrounds of the people. So it undermines the whole thesis of what the industry was built on. And so inviting those differing voices, the data is so clear that, there's a book by Scott Page called The Difference, a mathematical and economics professor at the University of Michigan, who's made it clear that if you're trying to solve a hard problem, that the best way to do so is with diverse voices, even diverse intellect. And I'll end by this one point that I say all over and over again. The interesting thing about, again, if we just go back to math and probability and statistics, genius and talent are equally distributed in our society across gender and across ethnicity. That is a fact. The weird thing is that if you go into tall buildings in our society, as you go up those buildings, they become whiter and maler, suggesting that there is more genius and talent there. It's just actually not true. And so that means people are being left out that can make that organization a better organization, but you actually have to believe that, which I know to be true. I don't have to be convinced.
It speaks to be able to see your representation in positions of power like this.
We need to represent everyone's story. I remember when Meg Whitman, Whitman College was built in Princeton. I was on the board of Princeton at the time, and she was the first woman to have a college named after her on a campus that at that point was almost 300 years old. So Hobson College, which is not yet built, but will be built in 2026, that second woman, first Black person, says a lot about where we are in society, which is we have an epically long way to go.
Well, we talk about metrics. We talk about a great example of a Silicon Valley company leading the way, to your points, Mellody, with you and HP Inc., Enrique. I'm very curious, when you shut the doors, all the press people aren't saying all the right things. What are those impediments that are preventing us from getting to, not HP, but your peers? If we talk about it openly here, why aren't we able to accelerate this change at the pace this moment requires?
I think because even if for us that is a really important objective and where we put a lot of energy, it is hard to change. It is hard to change how people has been hiring for many, many years. It is hard to change those processes. There is a lot of unconscious bias at all levels of the organization. There are no references that young people see and think, oh, this is what I want to do. And then many people is left through the process. So accomplishing that change, which is really a systemic change across many layers of the company, many layers of the society, is much harder than what it seems. And it's not that there are bad intentions or in many cases people don't take it seriously. Change is hard and requires a lot of energy, a lot of commitment, a lot of passion. But it also, we need to acknowledge it takes time. As a CEO, I would like always to, when we make a decision, we would like this to happen the next day. But unfortunately, making progress takes time and takes perseverance. And I think this is what we need to put in place now and make sure that we stay focused and we drive this change over time.
And you mentioned your employees, Enrique, and that your workforce is trying to drive this change and wants to see this change. Is that saying that in your experience, 30 plus years there working your way up at HP, you have not seen that type of drive from the workforce for change? Clearly, we had George Floyd, Ahmad Arbery, Breonna Taylor. It's, you know, the list goes on, unfortunately, where we've seen horrible instances of racism and violence. Has that catalyzed something that's different now in your employees, or are executives recognizing it in a different way than they previously have?
I think it definitely had an impact and has created significant change. I think the murder of George Floyd made all of us aware of the situation that many of our colleagues were going through. When it happened, we organized a series of town halls when we had Black employees sharing their own experiences, sharing their own lives. And we did that on Zoom because we were all working from home at that point. But you could see people crying, not only because of the stories that were being shared, but also because many of us realized that these things were happening around us and we were not seeing them. And we were really feeling bad, not only because of the story, but because of we had not realized and had not taken action before. So I think many of us went through a set of very different feelings through the process. Really, we were very upset by what we were learning. We were then discouraged because many of us thought we had done a lot of the right things to make progress, and we realized that we were really falling short in accomplishing and driving the change that we needed to drive. And then once we went through this, we realized that we really needed to use this as an opportunity to accelerate change, to drive more change internally, to also use the strength that we have as a company to drive change externally. Because I always say our company is both a community, and we need to make sure that within our community we behave according to what we think we want to accomplish, but we are also a very strong platform that can be used to drive change externally. We can influence our suppliers, we can influence our partners, we can influence the communities where we are present, and we need to use that strength to accelerate the change that we all realized is absolutely needed.
That's very well put. And if it's beyond community, it's also legislation. You know, the legislation that mandated racial diversity on corporate boards in California. You know, I know Enrique, HP was the first company that jumped out behind that. Silicon Valley Leadership Group came out and endorsed that as well. And that's creating a real, I think, positive impact, although it's yet to be fully felt and realized. But Mellody, I want to ask you that same question. Our mutual friend, Ken Coleman, he talks about and he's an HP alum as well, Enrique, a legend here in the Valley, talks about the perishability of this moment. I always told him I'd use that line. How can we ensure that, you know, we're coming out of COVID, we're running around with kids, life's getting back to normal. How can we ensure that 5 years from now, when I sit and talk with you and Enrique, we're not having the same conversation about needing to do much, much more to diversify Silicon Valley?
Well, it is perishing in real time. And that is something that's worrying me, that it becomes a moment as opposed to a movement. And I think that's a very different thing. And so we need to get out of the moment space and into something that is more protracted and institutionalized. And the only way to institutionalize things is to institutionalize policies. What I worry about is that charismatic leader like Enrique, who carries this flag. I always tell people diversity and equity and inclusion is everyone's problems in the organization. It is something it's not something where edicts come from on high. It's everyone doing their part. I get challenged when I say that all the time. I have people at the early stages of their career who tell me they have no power. And I just remind them, Rosa Parks just decided not to stand up. She had no power that was identifiable at that point. She was on a bus and didn't get up when she was told to yield her seat, and she helped change the course of history. So I think what corporations need to understand is the institutionalization of this, just as we institutionalize everything from, how we think about Sarbanes-Oxley to how we think about all sorts of things that we do. We institutionalize them. So we create processes around them that hold us accountable. We call them at the Black Corporate Directors Conference, where we bring together all of the Fortune 500 Black directors, including those who sit on boards in the Valley. We talk about the 3 Ps: people, purchasing, and philanthropy. You already did my quote, math has no opinion. We think if it matters, it counts. So you show the math. And the math is to count around the people from the top of the organization to the rank and file across ethnicity, as I mentioned. On purchasing, we talk about business diversity, not procurement, because you don't procure investment managers, you don't procure investment bankers, you don't procure lawyers. The 21st century economy that we have, 2/3 of GDP is service related. And procurement often isn't looking at those service contributions, those tier 1 suppliers to the company. They're thinking about widgets that are bought or logistics and things like that. So we want to look at the corporate spend across every category and measure the diverse spend. And if it's not there, have a rationale for it. So we get it. There are no Black or brown companies that make semiconductor chips. That's going to be a 0 in that area. But in marketing, in financial services, and all these other areas, where do you stand up in terms of where you spend your money, which ultimately creates a virtuous circle of prosperity for all of society? And the last one is philanthropy. There, I think the tail is wagging the dog. People are very, very comfortable leading with telling you the donations that they're making. But diversity is not about charity. Diversity is not philanthropy. Diversity is about fixing your own house from within, not without. And charity is great. I'm glad that a lot of civil rights organizations have been helped in the wake of George Floyd. I have told some of my friends who run those organizations, don't even take the donation if it's not going to be multi-year. No hit and runs. It'd be better just to not build up around that and then have to deconstruct it later because you can't sustain the effort. But more importantly, for corporations to understand that is nice, but it doesn't absolve you from the bigger issues that exist in terms of true inclusion inside of your own organization.
Well, the point first of all, incredible perspective, Mellody. And there's so much that we could double click on there, although our time is beginning to run short. But Enrique, the point about purchasing, the economics that Mellody makes, I think is particularly impactful. Which I know has been a focus for you at HP around supply chain, et cetera. And also the bigger purpose, you look at a Fortune 50, Fortune 100 company and HP 50 billion plus in revenue, what it means for you to step out in a big way around DEI. And I'd love to just give you a platform here for a couple minutes to share that, to speak about purchasing power, to speak about how HP is stepping out and where you think that can drive change beyond Silicon Valley. Because we say at SVLG that we're trying to drive change in Silicon Valley, change the face of leadership here, that reverberates across corporate America, given the leadership role Silicon Valley has, frankly, in the world.
I think the good thing of Silicon Valley is that many of us are global companies. So if we can have a global impact, which is really what is necessary. But let me give you a few examples. And again, this is with this philosophy that we as a company are a platform. And as a platform, we can multiply the change because we really can influence what many other companies are doing. But for example, a few years ago, we already determined that for any marketing organization to sell their services to us, they need to meet certain criteria in terms of diversity in the teams that we are dealing with. And we have expanded that to other groups because we saw the impact this was having. And by driving those metrics, going back to if you have a goal, you can drive the change, we impose those metrics on our suppliers across the board, and this is clearly paying off and having an impact. We're also redirecting our purchase activities to companies that have already diversity, companies that were founded by Black or African American people that we can really help to grow and to have an impact in the communities where they are. That's another very important driver that we use. And again, with all this, what we really have is the opportunity of having a significant impact, not only in our companies, but in the companies that are doing business with us.
Well, thank you, Enrique. And maybe to pivot to a final thought here, and I would make it twofold. Mellody, first, I would ask, we've got a platform here, many CEOs in the audience, many of our board members that are listening here today. I would ask, what is your message to the leaders in Silicon Valley who are serious about driving change related to DEI to see this through and make it happen? That's one. And then let's not think about the CEOs, but think about those young interns like Enrique many years ago who also listen to our programming and are thinking about how they can one day find themselves in a position of leadership like all of us to drive change. I would love that, maybe the dual purpose advice, speaking to the CEOs and speaking to the young people in the audience, to share your perspective and final thoughts.
Well, first of all, Enrique was not the only intern. I was an intern at Ariel as well between my sophomore and junior years in college. And I have had one job since I graduated from college. Out of my class of 1,100 people at Princeton, I'm the only person who's had the same work phone number since I graduated in 1991. So
that's a good and a bad thing, Mellody, right? People can find you.
That's that. I like that. But what I would say about my advice to, first of all, the leaders, I told this story, and I hope that it'll translate in this situation. When I was growing up, my mother, I'm the youngest of 6 kids, and my mother would always tell me, Mellody, you could be or do anything. At the same time, she always let me know what I was up against. She never held back on the discrimination I would face, the challenges I would have, but she said, there's no excuse. You can overcome those. Enrique clearly had a tremendous career and has a tremendous career. I have had the same thing, but we are unicorns. Now, this is something that people understand in Silicon Valley as unicorns, and we might think unicorns happen all day long, but they don't. We are not indicative of the broader society and ethnic groups that we come from. And so the question is not to set your mind to, well, Mellody made it and Enrico made it, and they pulled themselves up, and so therefore anyone can do it. Miracles had to happen. The universe had to bend our way. So much had to conspire to create the opportunities that exist for us to be here, that you can't, again, if you go back to institutionalization or scaling them, you can't scale that change with the circumstances that got us here. So that's one piece. The second piece that I would say is back to my mother's story about you can be or do anything. I have an 8-year-old child, and I told my 8-year-old child, Everest, you can be or do anything. But I want you to believe that is true of anyone and everyone. I want you to look out into the world and believe anyone can be or do anything. That there is no correlation to their age, no correlation to their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, or their income, their economic prosperity or lack thereof. And if we take that point of view in looking at the world, I think it completely changes the picture in terms of what is possible. But you actually have to believe it. You have to come at the perspective of looking at people and thinking anything is possible for them. In Silicon Valley, I do believe that sometimes there's this righteous belief in meritocracy, that everyone here is really smart and everyone here is best in breed. I always give the story back again, one last point. If you go to Princeton and you are the child of someone who graduated from Princeton, you have a higher likelihood of getting in. That is not a true meritocracy. So people who are legacies have a better shot. that is one of the best universities in the world, and the Ivies see the world that way. So to believe that that is a true meritocracy, even at that institution of greatness, can be challenged. And so there is actually, when you think about true meritocracies, I have failed to find a true meritocracy because people get this thumb put on the scale for them for one reason or another that can change outcomes. So when you look at Enrique, and me, and you see this outcome, don't think, well, it's possible because it was possible for them. A lot had to happen. And we're just trying to increase the odds where more people can be like us and not held back because of systems.
Mellody, you are most certainly a unicorn in every way, and that's a very powerful close. And Enrique, the advice to your CEO peers, and then to Melody's point, to the young people in the audience looking to become, hopefully they aren't unicorns at that point, and there's much more in terms of representation at the top in 20, 30 years, but would love to hear your closing thoughts.
Sure. I think to the CEOs, I think the key message needs to be that diversity is not something that should be owned by the chief people officer or by the chief diversity officer. We need to own it, and we need to believe that this is something that is going to help our companies to do better. Because if we own it and we drive it, the change will happen. And I love what Mellody said before. We need to make sure that the moment that we have gone through during the last years becomes a movement. And if we all believe on that, I think it will happen. And then to the young employee, I will complement with what Mellody was saying, because I really agree that the message that anything is possible is the one that we need to drive them, is also to make sure that they always challenge the status quo, that they have now an opportunity of driving change because certain things are happening in a certain way is not definitely the right thing. And they need to drive this. They need to challenge how things are done, because if they do, they clearly have the opportunity of accelerating the change.
This has been incredible. Enrique, Mellody, thank you. And Mellody, I got those days for 2026 or 27. I got to get to Princeton when we have that unveiling. And Enrique, what you're doing around HP and driving this change in Silicon Valley, we're all grateful for. We have heard the call, right? A movement, not a moment. Thank you both. Incredible conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks.